Well, let's talk to Anne-Élisabeth Moutet, a Paris-based journalist and distinguished columnist for the Telegraph newspaper. Anne-Élisabeth, welcome. Good to see you. Evening is falling across France. How would you describe the sentiment in Paris after 5 nights of this?
The sentiment in Paris broadly is fed up with the rioting, because rioting, and especially this kind of indiscriminate destruction of equipments, of buildings, of schools, of sports centres, of community centres, of places that were paid for by French taxpayers to help the banlieues, for a value, if you measure from 2000 to 2015, of 150 billion euros. So it's seen as a complete waste and disproportionate. And I came back from the countryside this morning. The small grocery opposite my home had been destroyed. I mean, the windows had been destroyed. He had an iron curtain, and therefore he pulled it, but mostly he suffered damage. He is Moroccan. He's Muslim. He's furious. He thinks that this has no sense and is not related to what happened to poor Nahel.
I've been reading your newspaper column for the Telegraph, where you've put the boot into President Macron. I mean, how much of a challenge do you think these protests pose to the president?
I think the protests themselves pose not so much of a challenge because eventually they will die down. It's not good, but it's more the feeling in the country that the president is not following on any kind of promise that he makes, instead of restoring law and order. And the one thing that differs in this instance, as opposed to riots that happened in France in 2005 and 2007, was that the first reaction of Emmanuel Macron was to appease the reaction, saying this is an outrageous event. Nobody knew exactly how things had happened yet. And he said justice must be done quickly and it is unacceptable, which in a sense was saying, I'm not waiting as the president of the Republic. I do not respect the separation of powers. I will say immediately something that will make people happier. This is not the way. It's appeasement. It doesn't work. And the result is that there was a feeling that the power was weak and that the riots were stronger than they have been in at least 15 years.
The grandmother of the dead teenager has in the last few hours been speaking to the press and called for calm. Do you think these protesters, these rioters, are going to listen to her?
I'm not sure they will, because again, there have been difficult political protests in the history of France. It's not something we're unfamiliar with. This is entirely different. The kids say we feel discriminated and therefore we're going to loot. And hard left MPs like Sandrine Rousseau of NUPES, the Mélenchonist alliance, say, oh, but they're hungry. And then you see them torching cars and stealing Apple Watches. And so there's a disconnect between what they're really doing, which is essentially stealing consumer goods and destroying whatever they can destroy for fun. And it's something that has been growing in France, because ever since the beginning of the Alts, the end of the 90s, the tail end of perfectly peaceful marches, like first the May Day parade, stuff like that, not so much a parade as a traditional union march, you started having people whom the French started calling casseurs, who started indiscriminate violence, and there was not much repression. There was a feeling that if there was too much repression for illegal acts, we would get into more trouble, which of course is the surest way to get more of this as time goes on. And this is much more related to indiscriminate looting than it is linked to political protests. You have had in France political protests against racism from the 1980s. They don't look like this.
Just while you've been speaking, we've been looking at some of these extraordinary pictures from France, and they do put you in mind of the social unrest in the United States back in 2020, when we saw the murder of George Floyd. I mean, do you see any linkage between these two big stories in the United States and what France is going through at the moment?
Well, there are people, activists, who would like to make a linkage, but the truth is that the French police, which is not necessarily blameless, is not the American police. America is a country of about 300 million people. France is about 70 million people. In America last year, 1,200 people were killed by the police. In France last year, 7 people were killed by the police, and it's 7 too many. But still, it is not at all the same proportion. We're not talking about the same thing. We're talking about a country that fought slavery rather than enforce it. We were sending black MPs to the National Assembly during the Revolution. The president of the French Senate was black from 1947 to 1969. The history is different. Are we perfect? We absolutely are not perfect. But it's not the same narrative. We never had slavery in France. It's not the same thing.
You're a seasoned observer of France and far beyond. I mean, do you think these protests that we've seen over the last few days are going to lead to any real fundamental change in France?
I'm afraid not, and there needs to be change. There needs to be change in both the relationship to the police and the skills of the police themselves. We have in France at least 2 police forces. One is what we call the police, in which is large cities, and we've got gendarmerie, the gendarmes, who police the countryside and smaller towns. And the gendarmes are parts of the military. They are the troops that give birth to the elite brigades that work in anti-terrorism thing, and they're very competent. The police in France is badly paid, badly considered, not terribly well trained. They are scared, and they've given sort of terrifying interviews in which they say, look, we are called to help somebody because there's a crisis in a building, and people greet us with mortar fire, and they greet us with throwing their parents' washing machine, kitchen appliances on us from the 10th floor of the projects. So there's distrust on both sides, and getting something to sort of end that distrust would take an entirely different personality than Emmanuel Macron. It would take a very seasoned politician, somebody who can talk to both sides and generate some sort of trust. And somebody like Jacques Chirac, who had failings, could do that. And to some extent, Nicolas Sarkozy could do that for at least one side. But mostly, this is not the style of technocrat president that we have right now.
Anne-Élisabeth Moutet from the Telegraph in Paris. Thank you very much.